Before we get started, I just want to do a quick thank you to Ken and Robin for their excellent talks. It's been a true pleasure having you both here for Redbubble's first Redbubble Talk Tech Edition. So, without further ado, I know we've got a really hot question here somewhere up the front. He's ready to go. So, please remember that we're recording tonight, so it's not just for speakers, it's also so for those that weren't here tonight, they can hear your questions. So feel free to just raise your hand and I'll come over and give you a mic. Okay? Here we go.
This question is for Robin. Had you not selected Clojure, what would have happened to your team?
If we hadn't selected Clojure, what would have happened? I mean, we would have carried on in Java. Some of us would have been less motivated as a result. That's it, really. But I mean, that may have led to very bad things. You never know.
Oh, good.
It's a question for Ken. You said that your pure functions, the output was a script. Did that script support branches?
The technique that we use called free monads can support the full richness of a program, including branching and looping. In practice, how we're using it is not that sophisticated, but it has that sophistication to be able to do that.
So the interpreter that you built had to support those things there?
So you sort of define a set of instructions, and really it's just a data structure saying, get something from a database with whatever input, or something like that. And the interpreter is just a pattern matching statement saying, in the case that it's a get from database command, then do the, then there's some code here that returns a value. In the case that it's log error, then actually log the error. In the case that, and so forth. In the case that it's get config, actually return the config. And that's how, So the interpreter is actually very simple. You want as little code as possible in the interpreter because it's essentially untestable, or difficult to test.
Okay, thanks.
Mine's for Ken also. How did your Ruby developers find moving from a dynamically typed language to a statically typed language?
I'm not sure how they found that the typing aspect of the situation, that the learning curve was difficult because they had to do a lot of it the hard way. I'm not sure. I don't think it was particularly a problem.
Up the front.
Robin?
Yes.
Awesome. Bear with me, I'm sorry. So macros are often a massive selling point for most Lisps. I find I don't use them that often, but you also mentioned that it's actually considered bad practice to use them. Is that what you were saying? Or that it's considered in the Clojure community that it's not?
No, I didn't say it's considered bad practice. Certainly it's very powerful.
Yeah.
For people who are new to Clojure and who are new to functional programming, who are writing business software with a deadline and the usual constraints, I wouldn't recommend it.
Okay.
That's what I was saying.
Hi, another question for Robin. So you're using Clojure to build up what was essentially a new code base. Do you have any metrics on how that code base was in terms of maintenance down the track?
I don't have any actual values, if that's what you're after. I do know that it's very robust. There's not been any major defects.
In terms of changeability of the code, though?
My opinion is that it's good. Again, I've not been there for nearly a year and a half, so I don't have the current status. Sorry.
For testing, what framework did you use? Did you use Midge?
Yes.
Okay. And
Are you going to ask why we use Midge?
hold on, Desmond. We want to hear what you got to say.
Oh, I see the reason why he cannot ask you the question, because he's holding a glass of wine. So
I have a question for Robin. Hi, Robin.
Hi.
I was fascinated by the sentiment graph that you have, that with Java, Scala and Clojure side by side, and the sentiment sort of going up and down. And so we had a big sort of ups and downs for Scala, and an insane spike of enthusiasm for Java that then sort of completely died off. And then Scala, and then sort of some uncertainty with Clojure, and then everyone sort of got it, and and then it all went up. Are there some sort of stories behind the ups and downs in that graph?
Well, yes. To be honest, part of the Java going down at the start was we chose to experiment with Java as well. So we were using build tools that were new. I can't remember what they were, but there were a couple of tools we picked from the massive collection of available Java tooling and library, and they turned out to be more effort than they were worth, and that kind of annoyed people. That's not the best way to run the experiment when you're trying to compare the languages, but I think that was kind of a cheeky little play with Java, because we all knew what we were doing anyway. Scala varied a lot because of the build tool, because of SBT, which we had a lot of trouble with.
I'll concede that one.
You guys are making me work for it tonight. So I don't think this is the previous question due to this glass of wine, but could you both actually reflect on property-based testing? Did you use any property-based testing at Wild?
Yeah, we've been sort of at first tentatively, but more and more using property-based testing, and it's actually been really good. And there's so property. If you haven't come across it, property-based testing is popular in functional programming circles, where you kind of randomly generate this huge range of possible values that can go into your program, and the testing framework will kind of spam your program with this enormous range of randomly generated things. And it's a very good technique for proving invariants in your software that are too fancy for the type system to handle. So it's very popular in Haskell and Scala as well. So yeah, it's really good, especially for round trips. So when you're translating from JSON to something and back to JSON, you want to be able to go do a round trip and you get the same thing back, for instance. And if that spams, rather than sort of hand picking your own use case out of that, if it spams 1,000 different configurations and checks that they all round trip, that's an invariance that you can use that to test, and that's, it's great for that kind of thing, and more as well. So yeah, we're not fantastic at it. We're getting better, and yeah, we're doing more and more of that.
Yeah, I was trying to rack my brain. I don't think we did use it at all, no.
Are there ready-to-use libraries available, or do you end up writing many things from scratch because there's nothing available right now?
Is that for me?
Yeah, like both of you, with functional programming being so new, so you wouldn't have many things which are already implemented and available open source, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't think functional programming is that new. I think it's older than object-oriented programming.
Yeah, much older than H156. Okay.
Yeah. Having said that, I mean, Clojure is relatively new, but the JVM is not. There's a lot, and Clojure interoperates with Java quite nicely. So when you do need to get that really specific niche library, you just use the Java one. You can build a Clojure wrapper around it, which we did do. Having said that, we only needed to do that in one case, which was talking soap. For everything else we needed to do, there were existing libraries in Clojure that we thought were good enough to use. In fact, in most cases, much better than the Java libraries.
Yeah, we had an experience similar to Robin. It kind of varies. There's a bunch of... Scala's been around since 2003 now, so there's a bunch of libraries for a bunch of things now. But of course we have access to the full Java ecosystem. Often you don't want to use Java things because they leak side effects all over your code and that sort of thing. There's a particular type of open source project you get that's just some guy's random GitHub thing that is half maintained and has a fancy DSL but doesn't actually give you that much benefit. And you sort of have to pick your frameworks with care. So for instance, for CSV parsing, there was a bunch of half-baked things that we tried, and eventually we just picked a Java library for that one because, of course, people have been doing CSV parsing for forever, and the Java library, of course, had been used by 1 billion people and was completely bulletproof and really fast, and so it just made sense to use that and then just wrap it so it doesn't leak side effects everywhere. So it depends, but being on the JVM is just such a big advantage, I think, for both languages.
Sorry, one more thing. Yeah, and that was actually something that you may have seen in the objective criteria for our experiment, was the quality of the libraries available for what we needed to do. As Ken said, there are lots of libraries. Some of them are better than others, but it's pretty easy to tell from GitHub. If you look at how many stars, how many forks, when the latest commit was, what issues are open, if the issues are being responded, that kind of stuff. And that was actually one of the more useful objective measures that we had.
So Ken, to address your response, how do you wrap things up so that someone does not pull the carpet from underneath your feet? Because if a underlying library that you use actually mutates state, how do you protect against that?
Generally a library doesn't have access to our state because all the stuff we define is immutable and can't be modified. It might have state itself that changes, and in that case we have to perhaps we can write immutable structures that map to its structures, or more often the thing is it throws exceptions left, right and centre, and we want to catch those exceptions and wrap them into a sum type that we can deal with in a more sensible and type-safe way.
All right, we've got time for one or two more questions. So.
I think it could be a question for both of you. I'm not sure whether you have a chance to check out Alexa. I think it's getting more, interest in Ruby community, especially because of the syntax and stuff like that. Also, it's based on Erlang VM, so I'm not sure whether you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't know a great deal about Alexa. I see it's gaining popularity with Ruby people. I think syntax is the worst possible reason to get excited about something, and yet so much of the programming world just goes nuts over syntax, and that's part of the reason why we're in the mess that we're in. Now, Elixir might be a great language, I don't know, but this is a terrible reason to flock to a language. Robin.
Yeah, similar to Ken, I don't have much experience with Elixir, but I'll jump on that bandwagon about syntax as well. A big complaint about Clojure is the parentheses everywhere. But I mean, that's just not familiar. It doesn't mean it's difficult. There are plenty of very difficult things to understand about object-oriented programming. At one point you learnt those, so it's not that difficult to look at some parentheses and work out where the corresponding ones are on the other end. It is a code smell in Clojure. If you see a bunch of parentheses next to each other, it usually means you need to do some refactoring, but aside from that, it's not really a big problem.
How confident are you, in terms of testing, that you would like to recommend Clojure to anyone, or what is the language? Functional programming? Yeah, Scala.
if you would use certain testing methodology, say, look, I've done all those tests, and it's really good, and I'd like to recommend to you. So just tell me more about your testing strategy.
My testing strategy in terms of code or in terms of testing out the language as a language to use?
Everything you want to convince people to use Clojure. Yeah.
Okay. As I said, like we've used it in that project. That was a successful project. There was also the happiest project I've ever been on, if happiness is a metric you care about. It's also not the only Clojure project that ThoughtWorks has ever done. There are several projects around the world where ThoughtWorks has introduced Clojure. And unfortunately, Melbourne is a bit of a ghetto. There isn't much functional programming going on in Melbourne compared to even Sydney or Brisbane, but also London or parts of Europe and the States. So I think it's proven. I think it's tried and tested. If you go on the internet and look up Clojure at a bank, that's a bunch of stories on a blog from a team in a bank in London. I mean, the fact that financial institutions are using it, they're usually pretty conservative. So if IWF, and I can't remember the name of the bank in England, but if they're using it, I think that says it's pretty mature.
Yeah, I'd add to that by saying there's stacks of enthusiasm for functional programming and functional programming talent in Melbourne, but the companies of Melbourne are lagging behind. It's more, there's more actual corporate take-up in Sydney and Brisbane and the rest of the world, so get your act together, Melbourne. You talked about testing, I mean, the way to make things testable is to make them simpler and more separated, better separated, with a better separation of concerns. And this is like one of the big slam dunk wins of functional programming. And what you really want in a test, so I mean a function, it's just input, output. Give it this input, I want to assert that I get the output I expect. That's it. That's the little parts of the program, but the big parts of the program are just the same. They look the same. They're built out of lots of little parts, but it's the same thing. You just put in the input, check the output. You can't ask for anything simpler than that.
Okay, can everyone join me in thanking Ken and Robin?